It's good to have you all with us.
So, Congressman, I'd love to hear what you learned yesterday in the briefing. We'll get to what you still need to know, but what did you learn that you can pass along to our friends that are watching right now?
Yeah. So the briefing yesterday was, 75%.
First of all, who briefed?
It was the Attorney General, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Archivist Marco Rubio, the gang.
Yeah, and Marco Rubio had 4 of those 5 jobs. But go ahead.
Exactly, and we may have a few more in the coming weeks. So 75% recounting by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of a truly remarkable raid. I mean, this was, in fact, one of the most complex things the United States military has ever done.
By the way, and it reminds me, just more reporting, my conversation with Donald Trump yesterday. He talked about how extraordinarily impressed he is with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Right. So that was 75% of the meeting. Now, we all agree, incredible raid. Maduro, very bad guy. No argument here. What the other 25% of that meeting was a very concerning, very clear lack of a comprehensive plan, of any plan whatsoever, for the day after. And that's important because, as everybody at this table remembers, we're pretty good at breaking stuff, at taking out the bad guys. What we're not good at, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, the list goes on, is what happens the next day. And I think we're at the end of that 72-hour period where we say, amazing, amazing raid, but what comes next? And look, the same regime is in charge. There's a lot of guys with a lot of interest and a lot of equity in drugs and oil and stuff with guns. So, we may have hit the high water mark of this thing, 24 hours ago.
So what's the justification that you heard? Drugs? Was it oil? What was the justification? Because there were people who criticized Secretary of State Rubio for telling Congress the last time he was there that this administration was not interested in regime change.
Well,
was there an explanation there about how that changed?
As they say, it may not be the nearest alligator in the boat, but I was in a lot of those meetings where, the most senior senators and leaders said, is there plans to do what ultimately was done? And the answer was absolutely not.
And that came just for our people watching, that came at the same time Susie Wiles had told Vanity Fair that the administration was, in fact, focused on regime change.
And so, I think you have to take the president at his word. Marco Rubio has, as far as I can tell, not uttered the word oil. This all started in early September around drugs. Never mind that, the drugs that kill Americans are fentanyl, not the cocaine that comes out of Venezuela. But look, I think you have to take the president at his word. 22 times in his press conference did he use the word oil. So, and look, we know Donald Trump, the prospect of a deal, which I think is fantastical, but that's what's driving this thing.
So, Congressman, you get this briefing a couple of days after the action has taken place. What is your expectation as a member of Congress about what you should have been told before this raid happened? The administration framing this as a law enforcement action because there was this indictment. They were getting this guy and extraditing and bringing him to a courtroom here in New York City. They say this is not an act of war. We didn't have to tell you. They said they were worried about leaks if they told Congress. What, in your view, should the administration have done in dealing with you?
Well, so the leaks argument is crazy, right? First of all, even if there are leaks, the law says that we have to be involved and consulted on this sort of thing. And by the way, as far as I can tell, the Gang of Eight has never leaked. I've never seen that happen. But we've had a multi-generational, 50, 75-year argument over who has war-making authority. Presidents of both parties have claimed uncomfortably for members of Congress more war power than I think the Constitution awards them. But this argument that this is not a war, something like 20% of United States naval combat power was involved. Every single one of the services, hundreds of men. And when the bill is tallied, this is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditure. So think about that. I guess the next bunch of presidents just get to say this is not a war, and therefore Congress doesn't get consulted.
All right, more from the briefing in just a moment, but give us a sense of the insight you got from the president when you spoke to him yesterday.
Well, he was, as I said before, he was excited and he's very proud yesterday when I talked to him. And I tried to gain some insights on his decision to launch a military attack on Venezuela. And most of that 20-minute call, the president was recounting how the United States military did, as the congressman said, act flawlessly. The execution of the operation and the courage that was shown by those men and those military people who raided Maduro's fortress. Now, quickly they dispensed of the Cuban troops that were guarding Maduro. the president concluded a summary of the attack by noting that he thought it sent a very strong message to Putin, Xi, Iran, and other people that wanted to do the United States harm. Now, as with most conversations that we've all had with Donald Trump over the past 2 decades, the challenge is often looking for a chance to get a break in to ask a question. And when that opportunity came, I commented how most people consider the military's operation to be flawless. However, my question had to do with what came next. Was there a plan for timelines, for reconstruction, for elections, for democracy? The president's answers were the same that he gave publicly, but when I pressed him for comparisons to America's failed occupation in Iraq, the president's response was totally different, because my concern was, of course, as I said yesterday on the show, when the president said, we're going to do everything. And so I said to him, I said, when you say you're going to run everything, that causes real concerns because of the disaster of Iraq. And the president said to me, Joe, the difference between Iraq and this is that Bush didn't keep the oil. We're going to keep the oil. And to underline that point, the president said his comments were no longer on background. And he said, in 2016, I said we should have kept the oil. It caused a lot of controversy. Well, we should have kept the oil. And we're going to rebuild their broken down oil facilities and pay for it by keeping the oil. Saying the United States is entering a new era of geopolitical entanglement seems to be an understatement. The president's brazenness, it seems to me at least, draws less from what's happened since World War II and more from what happened since 19th century imperialism. And Congressman, let me just say, yesterday we heard the State Department putting out a statement saying this is our hemisphere. We have a right to do what we want to do. And then, of course, that was followed by Stephen Miller talking to Jake Tapper, where he said we can go into Greenland if we want to go to Greenland and nobody can stop us. So I know a lot of people in Congress are pleased that Maduro is out. I don't know that a lot of people would really object to Maduro, an illegitimate president being out of that country, illegitimate dictator. But the question is, are Republicans, because there's some good Republicans that you work with, are Republicans going to step up on some of like Greenland and some of these other operations and start checking the president's power and the administration's power and say, hey, you need to consult with us before you move forward, because that's what the Constitution says?
Yeah, not in any public way are they going to do that. They're having a rally at the new Trump Kennedy Center today, and I think it's going to be really a pep rally around the military achievement.
Who's having a rally?
So the Republican conference is meeting this morning with the president at the Kennedy Center. And this is the stunning thing, particularly given the 5th year anniversary of January 6th, a really horrible day for all of us. 2/3 of the Republican conference wakes up every single morning and says, what can I do today to prove my loyalty to this president? And they're not thinking about, as you point out, this thing about we're taking the oil and it's our hemisphere. Think about how that lands on Mexican ears, on Brazilian ears, on Argentine ears. By the way, it's not limited to our, our backyard either. It's Denmark. It's, it's the world. And what's shocking about that is that we are in a geopolitical race with the Chinese right now. And the one absolutely distinguishing advantage that we have are our allies. And Donald Trump 24/7 is telling our allies to go pound sand. And I think that's a dangerous thing.
So, Rich, you can talk about the plan such that it exists, that for what comes next in Venezuela, but also this larger, what sounds a lot like a Trump foreign policy doctrine yesterday from Stephen Miller, talking specifically about Greenland, but more broadly, basically saying the world is ruled by force. We have the most force. We are the strongest, most powerful country in the world. Therefore, we can do as we wish. See Venezuela, potentially see Greenland. What do you make of that?
It's exactly what they think. Look, up to now, for the last 80 years, American foreign policy was based upon consent. We had allies and others who basically wanted to work with us. Now we're basically saying we don't care whether you want to work with us. We're going to do it coercively, which is basically was the Soviet and is now the Russian approach to foreign policy, increasingly Chinese. Can I circle back to Joe's conversation with the president? He said the difference between Iraq the 2003 Iraq War and now is then we decided we didn't keep the oil then. That was a big mistake. No, the biggest difference between Iraq in 2003 and now is then we decided to boot out the regime. Now we've decided to keep the regime. The insight into understanding what's happened in Venezuela is this was not regime change. This was,
what do you know about the vice president that's now running the country?
Well, I've never met her. I spent a lot of time in Venezuela. I was once sent to deal with Chavez, one of my less successful diplomatic forays. Let me just put that on the table. Never met her when I was there. I know.
But reports are there's not much difference between
that's the point.
Her viewpoint and Maduro's viewpoint of how the country should be run.
She was the vice president when he stole the election. She is part of the regime. Her brother is part of the entire, shall we say, security infrastructure. Basically, nothing has changed. That's the point here. That the reason they don't want to support the opposition, they don't want to have regime change. One, that this is not an administration that prioritizes democracy and human rights. We know that. But also, they have a deal with these people, with the vice president and others. And if you support the opposition, you are setting in motion a civil war. And then you would have all the questions about whether we intervene. So to understand this is
so no de-Baathification here.
No de-Baathification, no disarmament. Essentially, this is continuity with all except Maduro. And we've basically, and Maduro apparently wouldn't reach a deal where he would give us what we wanted in the way of energy access and so forth. He wasn't prepared. Okay, then now we seem to have a deal that we get that. And that's why this is it's interesting. And the question is whether this is sustainable. What happens if the deal breaks down and if leadership change doesn't give Stephen Miller and the president what they want, if things begin to unravel, because there's lots of cross currents in Venezuelan society, then what? So the administration thinks this is going to be essentially cheap and easy. What happens if it's not?
Mike, really quickly, you brought up Stephen Miller. We had obviously talked about the Jake Tapper interview. He was also interviewed last night where someone asked him, I think from CNN, about what his plans were for running Venezuela, and he pushed that off, saying it was actually Marco Rubio.
Stephen Miller said that.
Yeah. From what I saw. Yeah, I could be mistaken. Alex, check on that, but I saw a clip where he laughed it off and said that's Marco Rubio.
Now Marco Rubio, how many jobs does Marco Rubio have now? He's got 4, 5, 6 jobs.
We were just saying 5 of the 6 jobs.
I mean, which begs the question. The United States Congress seems relatively powerless thus far against this administration, both House and Senate. You're a member of the House Intelligence Committee, so you know what's going on around the world with regard to our allies. How many of our allies do you think now lean toward the fact that they're alone? The United States is not there with them the way history is since World War II. We've always been with the world, and the world has always been with us. Is that any longer the case?
I mean, of course, since President Trump started making ambiguous comments about the support of Ukraine against Russia, Europeans heard that loud and clear. And I don't have a meeting with a European where, maybe after a glass of wine, because people are pretty diplomatic, but they say, wait a minute, are you guys there? If the Russians march into Estonia, do you abide by your NATO commitments? And the fact that today that's even a question, I happen to believe that we do. Look, no one in the Congress is supine by design, right? The Republicans know that if they stand up against this president publicly, it's game over. But I would point you to something, the sort of esoteric and complicated National Defense Authorization Act. There you had Republicans more traditionally standing up for minimum troop levels in Europe, standing up for defending the Baltics and stuff. So they do it very, very quietly.
And also, very interestingly, also putting more pressure on Pete Hegseth to report back to Congress.
Yeah, again, not so much.
Not as much?
Yeah.
Was that over-reported?
Again, Pete Hegseth is pretty close to the president, and right now the Republican conference in particular is just consumed in this testosterone wave.
I thought in the authorization bill there were more requirements that were put on Pete Hegseth.
You're absolutely right, including, by the way, that he released the video, unredacted, of the strike on those 2 individuals that were clinging to the wreckage of the boat. So, you do. Again, publicly, these guys are 100% behind whatever the president wants them to be.
Can I stop you right now and ask you about that? Because I'm dismayed that more Republicans haven't spoken out about that. I'm a pretty conservative guy. Militarily, I grew up in a household of cold warriors. My dad, he was all in. And I understand things happen in war. I understand things, presidents. I understand Barack Obama did a lot of things that caused me deep concerns. George W. Bush, the same. It's happened time and again. I understand, though, bad things happen in warfare and when the military has to complete an operation. But when two men are clinging to a piece of wood in the middle of the Caribbean, and they're floating for 45 minutes, and they are blown to pieces when they are not even moving towards the United States, when they have no ability to communicate, when they have no ability to cause any threat to anyone. I want you to, again, tell our friends watching what you saw, why you said it was one of the most disturbing things you've ever seen, and why every American, Republican and Democrat alike, needs to see that video.
Yep. I've seen a fair number of those videos over the years, often, highly classified counter-terrorist activities. And this was very different because when we do this stuff, and the military's been doing it for a long time, since 9/11, it's guys with AK-47s. They're on their way to do something terrible, right? These two guys were probably 45 minutes away from slipping under the waves. They just had a major munition explode above their heads. They were probably terribly wounded. And as you pointed out, we watched them for a long time, and then we incinerated these two, who were probably an hour away from death. And the reason you haven't seen that video, in politics, visuals matter. What I'm saying right now is not really penetrating. If the American people saw two probably wounded, desperate people get incinerated by the power of the United States military.
They would be termed distressed mariners.
That's exactly what they were. Now, I'm sure they were bad guys.
They were bad guys, but I'm just saying, by the rule of law, by America's own military rules.
Exactly.
Forget the Geneva Convention. If you want to, this is the United States military's own rules.
Right.
They would be defined as distressed mariners who were to be rescued.
Right now, the administration is riding this wave of emotional satisfaction that comes out of ending the bad guys. It's a Schwarzenegger movie. It's Hollywood. We're ending the bad guys. The moment the American people see the United States military obliterate two individuals. Now, by the way, Pete Hegseth has released every other video. Every time he takes down a boat, the video is up on Twitter in no time at all. The reason the American people have not seen this video is the reason you're getting emotional about this. If you see that video, everything changes for you because you say, look, I may hate drug dealers, but I love my country, and the reason we're a great country is because we are better than this.
And let me just say also, Mika, just again to underline this. If these, quote, narco-terrorists were such a danger to the United States way of life, they and others that were on these boats would have been scooped up, brought into prison, put at MDC, and tried just like Maduro. But the State Department, after September 2nd, started scooping these people up and helping them return to their home countries, facilitating these, quote, narco-terrorists return to their home country. Doesn't sound like they consider them to be so dangerous.
No, I don't understand why we haven't heard more stronger reaction from Republicans. We talked